So why ethnic Russians have privileges in the face of the war and whom Kremlin is going to mobilize next? We'll discuss with my next guest, Charles Kupchan, former Senior Director for European Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. Hello and welcome to Spotlight Ukraine. So, Russia continues to pursue the obvious death of its citizens, and the majority of victims are among national minorities. And that's because, for the most part, they were mobilized from regions far, far from Moscow. So why does the Kremlin carry out such ethnic cleansing, and why do they do this?
I think there are a couple of different reasons. They go back to the preference of President Putin to minimize the effects on his mainstream supporters, on the bulk of the ethnic Russian population. And as a consequence, to pretend that this is a quote-unquote special military operation, he is trying to raise the troops needed to go fight the war in eastern Ukraine from indigenous populations, letting people out of prison to join Wagner. And so this is an effort to try to minimize the impact of the war and the impact of conscription on average ethnic Russians. And also, these are populations that are out of the way. They are in rural areas more than they are in major cities. And in that respect, I think the calculation here is that the costs to the regime, the costs to the Kremlin will be lower. And quite frankly, I think part of it is attitudes among the dominant Russian population, which may somehow value less the lives of ethnic minorities than the lives of their own ethnic compatriots.
Yeah, sounds pretty fair. But Russia's war against Ukraine forced the Kremlin to look for forces to replenish its own reserves among, for example, like you already mentioned, the Wagner mercenaries. And meanwhile, the armed forces reported the destruction of the most of Prigozhin's so-called volunteers. So who else can Russia use in this war against Ukraine? Because we've heard that the prisoners are running out, and who's going to be the next one?
Well, I assume that the authorities in Moscow will continue to rely disproportionately on minority communities. They will also attempt to raise new conscripts. That's not easy because we know that thousands of Russians have left the country to avoid conscription and getting sent to fight in the war. Nonetheless, Russia does have a population that is quite a bit larger than Ukraine's population. And so I think the idea here is that Russia can ultimately use numerical superiority to offset Ukraine's main advantages, which are, number one, more willpower. Ukrainians are defending their homeland. Russians are fighting on someone else's homeland. And number two, Western weapons. And we're seeing the West increase both the quantity and the quality of weapons in Ukraine. I'm guessing that will mean a certain amount of success in the coming springtime offensive. But the Russians, I do believe, will continue to try to raise fresh recruits to stay the course and perhaps bank on the assumption that the longer the war goes on, the longer or the better the chances will be for Russia.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to ask you the next question as an expert. So, because this is quite a simple but still very complex question. So why do so many Russians, even after a year of the full-scale invasion to a different country, turn a blind eye to the war in Ukraine? Because they listen to the radio, they read the reports of the Ministry of Defense, both of the countries, because this is 2023. But still, they turn a blind eye to the war in Ukraine. Why?
I think a big part of the explanation is that the Putin regime has succeeded in essentially controlling the narrative, putting out information about the war that is intended to contain opposition and build public support. And it seems to be working. We've seen public opinion polling from the Levada Center, which is a pretty credible public polling institution, and that suggests that 70 to 75% of the Russian public still supports the war. We've seen Putin crack down on media that doesn't present the party line, and some of those media outlets have taken up shop outside Russia's borders because otherwise they wouldn't be able to continue their reporting. So yes, you're right to say that in today's world of social media, of alternative sources of information, one would expect the Russian public to have a better sense of what's going on. They don't. And I think that's because a lot of Russians still get their basic information from mainstream Russian television, mainstream Russian radio, and they're not hearing the truth about the causes of this war, that this is an act of aggression by Russia against Ukraine, nor do they fully understand that the war has not gone well, that Russian efforts to take over large chunks of the country have failed.
That's because most of Russians, they just refuse to feel themselves guilty and responsible for all the crimes, because it's easier way just to close your eyes and pretend you're not seeing anything, instead of just having those guilty.
I'm sure that that's part of it, but I also think that the propaganda that is put out by the authorities is reasonably successful in convincing Russians that they're waging a moral war and that Ukrainians were controlled by Nazis, that Ukraine was turning into an outpost of NATO that would pose a threat to Russia. There are lots and lots of different mistruths that the Russian government puts out there to try to sustain support. Frankly, it's reasonably successful in doing so.
So the West and the Ukrainians are anticipating the spring counteroffensive of the Ukrainian armed forces. So what is your assumption? When will the counteroffensive begin, and how far will the Ukrainian army be able to go?
I wouldn't want to venture a guess as to when the offensive is launched. I think a lot will depend upon the judgments of military commanders. I am assuming that what's happening as we speak is that those commanders are waiting the arrival of more armored vehicles, of main battle tanks, of more ammunition, and of the other kinds of equipment that would enable the Ukrainians to be able to break through Russian defenses. We are assuming that the main focus of the offensive will be in the south to try to break the land bridge between Donbass and Crimea. We also know that the Russians have dug in tank traps, trenches, other kind of defensive fortifications, which makes it very important for Ukraine, its military, to have those armored vehicles and those tanks, because they will be needed to break through Russia's defensive lines. Do I expect the offensive to make progress? Yes. Do I hold out hope that Russia will be able to be completely defeated and that by the end of this year, Ukraine will be in possession of all of its borders, all of its territory? There, I think we just have to wait and see what happens. But I do think that it's probably unlikely that over the course of this year, we will see the full restoration of territorial integrity.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Charles Kupchan was the guest of Spotlight Ukraine. Really appreciate that you found some time for us. Thank you. Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Latest news, trends, and analytics on all about Ukraine. Like, share, and subscribe. Any questions, proposals, and comments, contact us via email.